Hi folks, thanks very much for joining our Monday Mindshare, and real treat today to have one of our up-and-coming pros, Elizabeth Heinbach, on the show, and her coach, Aaron Geiser. How are you guys?
Good.
Fantastic.
Hey, so where are you dialing in from today? Where are you based?
I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Okay.
And I'm in Northern Kentucky, but only about 20 minutes south of her. So we are able to get out this morning and even do a little bit of training together. So it was nice.
Starting to warm up your way, I guess.
I would say that.
Folks, you've probably seen that we've been beginning to run our program this year for our Going Pro athletes, which includes Elizabeth and also Matt Kerr, and telling their story through the year as they get into the season proper. And would love to just explore a little bit of your background, Elizabeth. I'm sure everyone's always interested to hear where you came from and what's the plan and where you're going. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I think I'll first start with, I guess, my background in a triathlon started. My mom did an Ironman. It did an Ironman Lake Placid in 2002.
Okay.
So when I saw that, I always wanted to do one.
Where was that? Which race?
Lake Placid.
Oh, Lake Placid. Okay.
Yep. So then I swum most of my life. I think I started when I was 6, and then I swam and I ran track and cross country in high school.
Okay.
But I was pretty much always injured running. So I ended up swimming in college. So I swam D3 at Stevens Institute of Technology. And I went to NCAA's twice, I think my freshman and my sophomore year.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was that, freestyle, or what distance were you typically racing?
I think I qualified in the 400 IM both times. So
Okay.
a lot of distance, 400 IM, mile, 500.
That's a good background for triathlon, for sure. Not that there's a lot of butterfly and breaststroke in triathlon, but yeah, well, that's cool. And Aaron, maybe I know a lot of folks, obviously on our ambassador racing team, know you well as the head coach, but maybe just the background for you at endure.iq, and then also just your background as coach and mentor to athletes.
So my hooks from triathlon came into my lifestyle a little bit later in life. I was 35 at that time, but it kind of fit into my education and some of the certifications that I had. And it really kind of, in the exercise physiology wing of things, this is kind of a hand-in-hand process. And I had a family friend that continued to drive me to, hey, are you ever going to do a triathlon? Are you ever going to do a triathlon? I think he wore me down to a point where I towed my first line, and the hooks just got deep. And since then, it was a matter of diving in full body to try to learn and improve all aspects of myself at that point. And then I started to see how that connected, and I could push that out to other athletes. And it's now become a lifestyle and a profession for me, just from really saying yes to that first race and towing that line.
Well, I'm going to ask you later what that first race was and what time you did, and we'll do that. So also for Elizabeth, for yourself. It's always we've all got a great story of our first race, right? But I guess the obvious question, Elizabeth, like, or maybe it's not obvious, but what was it that pushed you over the line to think I could possibly be a professional at this? And we will get into talk about all your races in a second, but I mean, there must have been something at some point that in the back of your head, I could probably be a pro at this.
I honestly think Aaron was probably the first to float that.
I will take credit for that one. I think the first time I told her that, she looked at me like I was partly crazy.
Is there, though, in the racing you've done, though, and obviously as an amateur, you take off in different waves versus when the pros start. But one of the great things about this sport, of course, is that you're on the race course together with pros. Was there any observation of a pro or pros that you looked at and you felt I can do that too.
I don't know, because I know in 2021, which was kind of my first full season of racing, I don't think I had any races that had a pro field besides 70.3 Worlds.
Right, right.
So I really wasn't out with any pros until I think Eagleman in 2022 was the first time I was actually out on the course,
With them.
starting a little bit behind them. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You didn't go past them, not yet, but you will. You will. Hey, so Aaron, you mentioned you're seeing a lot of athletes, you're training, coaching, and some of them you're just mentoring. When you looked across your athletes, you came to SFuels saying, "Hey, we have this athlete, Elizabeth Heinbach." You started talking about some of her numbers and data. What was it particularly that had you stand up and take notice of Elizabeth?
Well, at this point, she's still very, very young in the sport. And we in her particular case, we did get some benefit from the COVID year of not having the pressure to stand up to any races. It was, we came together early on in that process, and we were able to just dive into training. And one thing that I truly enjoy working with Elizabeth on is she approaches training very similar to me. It's very serious. She understands the importance of that. And in that time, I saw the progression where she was able to make improvements by not racing. And we're now in that point where she can make the greatest improvements is now towing some lines, getting out there and getting that experience from a race standpoint. But the fact that she was able to produce the results that she has as quickly as she did after that COVID year had me knocking on your door and bringing attention to her, because I do truly feel like there is something special on that side of it with her. And I really feel like at this point in the relationship with triathlon from her, there is a very, very high ceiling. And the capabilities there are really, with the way that she attacks things, with the way that she dials in and focus, that there's that great opportunity. And I think that there's no better group out there to partner with outside of SFuels, because that race nutrition is really going to allow her to drive and be that potential athlete that she has the capability to be.
Yeah, and you guys said it while new to the sport. If I'm looking at the data here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Elizabeth, but I've got here 2019 Ironman 70.3 Ohio, 6 hours 13, 26 seconds was
Yep.
the kickoff to the career, right?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, Aaron, did you race that race, by the way?
That one I did, actually. 2000, I might have qualified for Worlds at that race.
Okay.
I think so. I think I did.
Okay. Well, yeah, so that's where it kicked off. So we're talking here, 3-4 years. That is new to the sport. I always feel I'm a bit of a youth in the sport, but you're much younger than me in this. So then, like you said, 2020 was obviously out cold for everyone pretty much, and 2021 became the first year, like you said earlier, Elizabeth, of, if you will, a season of racing.
Mhm.
The first race I've got, again, just correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just doing my homework here, 426 Ironman 70.3 Eagleman. So you basically came down an hour and 45 in your first race.
Mhm.
So my obvious question is, what the dickens did you guys do in 2020 to get an hour and 45 off?
Well, I think probably the most important thing to clarify is Aaron and I weren't working together when I did Ohio. I'm not even sure. I don't even know.
Point that one out.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we started working together, and I think maybe May of 2020, I think we connected.
I think it was a little bit earlier, actually. I think we
Was
got
it?
together. We luckily got introduced to each other at a holiday party by
Mhm.
Jamie, and we kind of built on that relationship. I want to say it was almost February or March when we got things started there in 2020.
It's still, that's just like at most a little over a year between getting in touch with Aaron and the squad at the endure.iq team, and that I think it's a June race, right? Eagleman,
It is.
So you took 4 minutes off on the swim, you took over an hour off on the bike, and you took over 30 minutes off on the run. So impressive. Right there, that one race, 4:26. You could almost say your first serious race. I totally agree, Aaron. I mean, it's impressive to kind of start with that as a baseline.
And this performance was the one that I remember, because I was lucky enough to travel with her to this race, and she finished the race. She looked at me and she's like, "So did this surprise you?" I looked back at her and said, "No, not at all." So this
Clearly
is exactly
you were,
where I
Elizabeth.
thought
Clearly you were.
you
Yeah,
should have
absolutely.
been. And she had this look of, man, I really wanted to surprise her.
That is really awesome. It's something else. 4:26 on your first, somewhat serious race. We'll come back to the full Ironman in a second, but if I just keep on the thread of the 70.3s, obviously the Eagleman, you placed first as age grouper, and then you qualified for the World Championship. But of course, this was the crazy weather year of Utah, I think 2021, right?
Yep.
So again, though, 28 minutes in the water, 2:54 on the bike, 1:36, and this is not an easy course for anyone that's even watched it, never alone done it. It's a tough course, but 5:06 you finished in, I think, placed 14th. But again, it's your first season of competing, and you're at the World Championship. That in itself must have been a bit of a a bit of feather in your cap, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I definitely left wanting to do it again and, feeling like I could have done a lot better. But it was my first time racing a course that was that hilly.
Yeah.
I, hadn't been out in conditions like that before. So I was also just happy to have finished.
Well, not many people have been out in courses with those conditions. So survival would seem to be the name of the game that day. It was crazy. So impressive stuff. And then you finished the year in North Carolina with a 4:43 at the race here in Wilmington, I think it is. That was October. And it's a fairly flat course, of course. But, again, swim time was very fast, 22:54. I'm not sure if there was a distance or a current, etc. that day.
There's a current.
Yeah.
But we will say that the bike is about 4 kilometers long. So it does have a little bit of a
puts and takes.
Greater distance. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So coming out of your first year, you've got a win in Eagleman. You've got a first World Championship experience and a crazy weather experience. And then you've got this finish off in 4:43 at the end of the year. As you finished that first year of racing, was it, I love this, I'm going back again, or it was, let's go back and revisit our training and just what worked, what didn't, and replay what we were planning for the second year? How did you think about it?
I think so. Finishing out that year, I'd come really close to qualifying for my pro card, but I hadn't quite, because one of the ways that you can qualify is with a score, and if you reach a certain score twice in the year. And I had gotten that score, I think, at Eagleman, and then I'd come really close at Worlds. So then I think going into 2022, the idea was get the pro card. So then at least I could decide if, I wanted to go pro then or not.
So Aaron was pushing in your first year of competing for considering being pro, huh?
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if I had qualified for it, Aaron would have wanted me to have taken it right away. And I was kind of thankful I didn't.
What's the story, Aaron? What's the truth of the matter?
Well, it's especially here in the States too. I mean, it is something that they reevaluate year over year. So once Elizabeth had that Eagleman experience in her book, she did start to realize some of the information that I was giving her, understanding that professional was an opportunity that she was going to be able to potentially reach. And I was looking at that more from, if we get the opportunity, yes, the timing might not be perfect, but we get the card, then you can kind of learn when you get
Sure.
amongst other pros. You never know what the following year's rules. There was
Totally.
the USA Triathlon had elections that year. You don't necessarily know what's going to take place as you progress forward. So I just kind of looked at it from the ideology of right time. It's the right time, because if you start flirting with this and this is your goal, there might be roadblocks, there might be turns that you can't control. So that was kind of my drive for that decision in that case.
Was it as we'll stay on the theme of 70.3s, but at what point did Aaron and you start working on manipulating diet and fueling? Was it from the beginning, or was it more 2022, or when was that?
I think it was fairly early on. I'm trying to
Okay.
think exactly when we did it, but it would have been, I think, in 2020.
I
Yeah.
want to say we took her and her boyfriend Steven through that process together around that kind of May 2020
Hmm.
Okay.
timeline is when we kind of addressed the, because not to throw him under the bus, he was a honey bun kind of guy. Elizabeth wasn't in his same kind of corner, so it was a little bit easier for her in the transition process. But we did go through that process a little bit earlier in that timeline.
Sure.
Mhm.
Well, I'm again just looking at your times as you go into 2022. Eagleman again, a similar on the swim, basically the same on the bike. Maybe it was a little slow. I thought maybe it was a bit of wind or something that day, but you did have a better run, a materially better run. You can begin to see, I think, some of the evidence of just being able to strong right to the end of these races. And then you went to the Worlds again, took another 20 minutes off, as we all know, like we said earlier, a very tough course, 4:46. You placed 7th there overall. Just talk us through that race, like any kind of observations as you do the race the second time. How did you feel about it?
I felt a lot better about it. I think Aaron and I had talked before the race, and he wanted me to take some more chances on the bike because I typically had kind of maybe held back a little. I think because that's my newest discipline. So I'm still, I think, kind of learning where that threshold is to push
Yeah.
on the bike and still have enough for the run.
Yeah.
So I pushed, I was really, really happy with the bike there.
Yeah, 236 the year before 254. So yeah, big material impact there, sure.
Yeah. And I think I did suffer a little bit on the run because of that. But I think it was a good confidence booster that it was my first time, I think, having a
Yeah.
really good bike on a course like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough course. And
Mhm.
for the record, just you may have forgotten yourself. You still ran faster in
Mhm.
2022 than you did in 21 on the run. You put 3 minutes into the year before time. So
Well, they did change the course. They made it a little flatter the
oh,
second
that's
year.
right. You're right. I remember, Aaron, that hill that's straight out of town, right? That was not there the second year. Probably a good thing. And then that was after that. So that was October, December then last year. I mean, it feels kind of long ago, but it's not long ago. Your first pro race at Indian Wells. Talk us through that, your experience there.
Yeah, that was a really fun experience for me because I had my boyfriend Steven came out, my parents came out,
Oh, that's
Aaron
cool.
was out there, Steven's parents were out there too. So we had a whole crew out there. So yeah, it was really fun. I think I tried to go in with just no expectations really and try to kind of
Yeah.
just navigate being in that field for the first time, going to a pro briefing. Um, and yeah, I think the race came together pretty well.
What's it like in the race briefing when usually just watching these folks through Instagram and YouTube, and suddenly you're sitting beside them in these briefings?
Yeah, I thought it was decently intimidating.
Decently intimidating. That's got to be quote of the week. I did go back and look at just who was in your field there in the 2022 Eagleman, and you're already standing beside the likes of Sarah True, Tamara Jewett, Jodie Stimson. I mean, these are quality, leading athletes. So, clearly through 2022, you began to get experience of towing the line, or at least being on the course together, like you said earlier. As you had that first race in Indian Wells and you're all going off the gun together, your background swimming, as you kind of weigh up and just observe these pros, where do you feel your strength is? Where do you think the big opportunity is for you for improvement, to really, be in that probably 4 hour sub or north 4 hour spot in time?
I think the biggest opportunity is definitely the bike. I think I'm still learning that. And just especially now, I think the dynamics as you start racing in the pro field, it's a little different.
Yeah.
But yeah, strengths are definitely the swim and then the run. Yeah.
Yeah. Aaron, observations yourself. Obviously, you are at some of these races observing Elizabeth.
She nailed it. The bike is the area that we just time on the saddle, time in making good decisions, quick decisions, knowing when to kind of stay in the line with other athletes, maybe when to let them go, when to turn on the dial and push them. So these are areas that Elizabeth is going to be able to. The good thing about it is, while we are close to each other, we are able to do some training together. And these are techniques, these are things that we can kind of work on together on outdoor riding in our environment. But this is the discipline where, as she said, it's the youngest to her. So there's just some natural development that's really going to take place for her, sitting in the aero bars, sitting on that saddle for longer periods of time. And we're getting close to that click. It's going to click, and then that's where that big time separation is going to start coming together and really get closer to that lower 4 time.
I was listening. Matt Kerr did his kind of pre-race feelings, expectations, if you will, video prior to New Zealand Ironman on the weekend. And just the thing about the bike is that there's so many data points that you can really validate in training and know what your body's capable of. And you can just sit right at those data points in a race. And you know that if you go too far over it, you're burning matches. And, if you just can't operate at that level in a race, there's probably something else going on. Just today, Zach Bitter took off a 100-mile race, got 40 miles in, temperatures off the charts. He had a fever, right? So, the data we have today to help us really navigate, I think, is really important. And being a professional, I assume you guys are just running all the math and all the numbers on this now.
Yeah, and I think part of it as well, because Elizabeth came from a swimming and running background, she knows what it's like to flirt with threshold or just sub threshold efforts. And with that bike being so young in her experience, there's that little bit of not knowing where the ceiling truly is.
Yeah.
And I feel like the more time that she's going to get exposure to that is really going to benefit her, and knowing kind of where that bumper guard, if you will, is going to be.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's just, I think for any of us, well, we all grew up in different types of sports. If you did track, what number of the 800 repeats that you're probably going to start being sick, right? So you get really clear and sharp on that. You actually don't even need to wear watches and things like that. You'll know exactly how it feels. So that's a really good point you make there, Aaron. Let's jump across to the topic of lab testing. And we were, privileged to have Elizabeth come out to Raleigh in North Carolina and spend some time in some labs there and start running the numbers through. I think this was the first time you had that experience, Elizabeth. What were your feelings and expectations going into that?
I tried not to have too many expectations, but feelings, I was definitely nervous because I didn't know much about the process beforehand, but I just knew you're going to exhaustion. So,
So folks, for everyone's benefit, we're talking, about basically a metabolic test, looking at VO2 max, and then particularly extrapolating the data from that to understand a little bit about the substrate oxidation of an athlete at various intensities. And Aaron, it'd be good, again, just having seen a lot of athletes come and go, what's your observations of what, good fat and carbohydrate oxidation rates are?
So for a long distance triathlete, we often see even really strong athletes at a 0.5, maybe a 0.8 in a lot of cases, where we start to see high fat metabolism is kind of above that 1.2. And really when we start to see kind of from that 1.2 to 1.5, we realize that there's a little bit more of a diesel engine there, and we're going to be able to get some bit more bang for our buck from fat oxidation in that case. So really we're looking at that kind of point for athletes in especially the long distance triathlon aspect of things, north of that 1.2 grams of fat per minute.
Yeah, we just wrote an article last week on some recent research, and I remember that in this sport, of course, most athletes, even pros, are running at 80, max 85%. And at that rate, by the textbook, most physiologies would suggest that you're mostly running carbohydrate. This study we just alluded to last week on a blog article we wrote was just showing that with intervention and with manipulation, you can actually be running at those kind of intensities, still burning, mostly fat, a majority of fat. And we see that before this paper. We've seen that with a number of athletes come through the labs. And the inverse also applies. You would assume that pros, because of the times they're putting out, their physique, that the fat oxidation would be perfect, and it's just not the case. It's really quite surprising, I think, for athlete and coach and the labs, as athletes come and go through these labs, on some of the numbers that came out. So I think,
Leighton, if I can add there, I mean, you have, as you pointed out, you have some athletes out there burning 190, 200, 210 grams of carbohydrates per hour, when right now the research really supports at the most you can absorb roughly about 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, 60 from glucose, 30 from fructose. And then there's that other part of that where fructose can suppress some of your fat oxidation. So there's some of that where if you start to extrapolate that data across that timeline, you start to realize that, well, you don't have any energy to really work off of on your stored body past either the last 3/4 of the bike or once you get into the run. So it really sets up that athlete for a large opportunity of failure, because they're just operating and so dependent off of carbohydrates, which have a ceiling of storage within the body and then also a ceiling of how much can be absorbed.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe just as a segue back to what we didn't talk about for your racing was Ironman racing. You've had 2 experiences of that so far, Elizabeth, but maybe you can talk to it. But I think what Aaron just alluded to is exactly what we see in a lot of athletes. You can get away with a lot up to that 4-hour, 4.5-hour, type of racing, whether it's ultra running, marathon running, triathlon. You start at events that are beyond that, and you really see the math of this, that unless you can weave a perfect line of taking carbohydrate, either the gut blows up or you hit the wall. But yeah, just chat a little bit about just your Ironman Texas, Lake Placid experiences.
Yeah, Lake Placid was more, so that was my first full in 2021. And I had more of, I guess, a mechanical issue on the bike. So that made for a long day. But at Ironman Texas, I would definitely say it was more of that issue. I made it through the swim and the bike pretty well. Was, I think, one of the top age groupers coming off the bike. And then I think made it through the first 8 or 9 miles of the run feeling pretty decent, and then kind of hit a wall pretty quickly. And
Yeah.
it was kind of a walk jog to the finish.
I don't know if you folks saw on the weekend down there in New Zealand, Matt Burton was pretty much at, in podium for most of the race. And then if you looked at his run time, 4:45 in the end. So, this happens to amateurs, it happens to professionals, and we see it every weekend. So yeah, I mean, as you said, Aaron, a lot of opportunity for upside in working with Elizabeth on, manipulating her substrates between both carbohydrate and fat. This is not just about fat at all. Any kind of initial thoughts as you think about training to date and going forward, more or less of things to manipulate?
Well, we came away with these particular numbers, as you said, with some increases to make. And we we have a pretty good idea of how Elizabeth is taking in nutrients right now. And what we are now looking at is devising a plan that is going to incorporate some additional aspects of fat oxidation with some longer duration training to really kind of drive that fat ox number. So we're going to have some volume and not necessarily change Elizabeth's diet, because we feel like we have a good structure there and foundation there. It's more of some of the areas around that and the supportive aspects, whether it be the addition of some caffeine, timing of that caffeine, and implementation of a few other aspects to really drive those fat oxidation numbers, to get those numbers to even drive a little bit higher to increase that potential that she has.
What is just in typically your protocols, Aaron, when you say long sessions and the athlete is, 70.3 is the race distance for long bikes and long runs in your protocols, what does that typically come out as?
So, of course, we're going to take a progressive approach, but Elizabeth can agree. She sees plenty of 4 to 5 hour rides, even as a 70.3 distance athlete at this point. She sees a good dosage of 4 to 5 hour bikes, and then anything from 90 minutes to 2.5 hour runs, just to kind of drive that endurance aspect. And of course, we're always asking the question of the context over the content. So therefore, what are our goals of that particular session? But definitely volume is going to be one of the things, because Elizabeth's not going to be a 70.3 distance athlete her entire career.
Right.
So we still need to start to lay the foundation of what that next portion of the career is. But even for this portion of her career, it's going to be so vital and valuable for her development in just putting that volume, making her more durable, and making her more of a fat burning machine.
How many hours a week, Elizabeth? And you're still, you have your pro card, still, holding down a full-time role as much as you're transitioning into professional racing. How many hours a week at this time of the season would you be typically putting into training?
I'd say right now I'm probably averaging around 15 hours. I think typically averaging 15 to 20 a
Okay.
week.
I
Okay.
think in a normal scenario, we are kind of 21 to 22. Then just normal like recovery practices and everything else, she's probably closer to 25, 26 in that case, when you start to factor in just kind of taking care of the body in that piece. But right now, the volume is roughly around 15 to 17 hours.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And folks, we had a good discussion with Aaron and Elizabeth through the week as we kind of digested the results. I think what Aaron alluded to, there's things like caffeine, there's things like carnitine, and one of the things we did also talk about is different ingredients inside of different teas, particularly green tea and white tea. All of these things can further propagate fat oxidation levels. But the dosage and the timing, like Aaron alluded to, is important. Most of that's in the optimization guides you can find online. But if folks have any questions on their own data or they want any guidance, just shoot us a note. Happy to help. So let's kind of play this forward. Your first race for 2023 this year is Oceanside. You wouldn't say it's totally a flat course. There's pieces of that run course which are quite up and down. Any expectations as I'm sure, like a good professional now, you're looking back at some of the past results, seeing how other athletes have completed the course. Any thoughts yourself for that race, Elizabeth?
Honestly, I haven't looked into it too much yet.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
We've strategically inserted strength training on the bike and on the run for that measure exactly. And luckily her coach was able to do some recon last year at this race, so has a pretty good idea of especially the closed parts that go on the base that you don't have the access to. The bike course is fairly hilly. It's a surprise. It's got 3 really kind of decent climbs where it brings people to a standstill, and
feels like a lot of the brochure of this race, Aaron, is like running on the seaside there, where it's perfectly flat beside the sea. Exactly. And then they forget to show you the hills of the bike ride.
Absolutely. And I think part of that is that you just, due to part of those hills being on the base, you don't get access to it. So it comes as a shocker to you. And I think between some of the pictures that you just talked about, where you're seeing people run along the sandy beach and waves crashing in, you're like, oh, that looks great. But then you get away from that, and it's the roads are fairly rough. There's a decent amount of climbing, and there's even a speed limit on the bike in one section downhill because it comes down fairly aggressively and has a real quick switch right. And if you go over, so they have a timing strip at the top, a timing strip at the bottom, and if you beat that specific time zone towards the end, you're disqualified.
Oh, really? Wow.
And I want to say Daniela last year got DQ'd for in that stretch going too quickly.
Interesting. Beyond Oceanside, Elizabeth, what's the plan for the rest of the thinking at this point in time for the rest of the year?
Yeah, so a lot of it is still open. But I'm White Lake 70.3 in May. We've kicked around the idea of 70.3 Maine, which I think is the end of July. And then we were planning on 70.3 Augusta, but Ironman released some of the pro schedule this week, and they threw in a bit of a curveball in that 70.3 Michigan is the week before and has a pro field. So I'll be deciding between the two of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, cool. It's just awesome to talk to you both, and like just the rapid progress. You don't see this often. So clearly there's some raw talent there, Elizabeth, and we're thrilled to work with you on this and wishing you all the very best for 2023. And Aaron, thanks for captaining the ship at SFuels and obviously mentoring Elizabeth to new heights. We appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. It's definitely one of the peaks of my day-to-day life, so I love it.
Cool. Well, good to talk to you both. Have a great week, and we'll be in touch soon. And folks, you can be watching closely as we go into Oceanside. You're going to see Elizabeth turn up there with Bob Babbitt and have the interview with Bob pre-race, and I'm sure you'll hear all about her thinking for the race ahead of her. All right, have a good week. Thanks again for joining us.